And then somebody asked to take it back. They're just nuts. No, this is good stuff coming up. All this stuff is good stuff. Some stuff is really good stuff. Some of the stuff is the stuff that'll change your life. That's the icing stuff. Cake is still pretty good. So you can have your cake and eat it. What idiot would just want to have cake? Isn't that the stupidest saying ever? Oh, they just want to have their cake and eat it too.
Someone with anorexia.
What? Well, even then, they wouldn't sit there and look at a cake. A bulimic maybe. But
Didn't you ever
he just wants to have cake without eating it.
You ever saw dodgeball? You ever saw dodgeball? People just want to look at pizza. And just putting pizza down his pants. I know what it's all about.
I don't remember that part. I'm going to do this
Now we're closer to the bar than I thought. And bacteria, as we were talking about the bacteria. People will tell you that there are good bacteria and there are bad bacteria. Have you heard this? Like that bacteria is in your gastrointestinal system, well, that's your good bacteria. You've heard this, right? Unless it goes somewhere else. Unless that same bacteria goes into your blood, then you die. Not really good. I'll wait till everybody is here. Are we back?
Okay.
Okay. Glucose. Glucose is used to make energy. Now, it has here, glucose is combined with oxygen is transformed in your mitochondria. But that's not totally accurate. Actually, glucose is broken down in the process of glycolysis, and that happens in the cytosol of the cell. It is the products of glycolysis that actually get converted into ATP in the mitochondria, in the inner mitochondrial membrane. But for all practical purposes, as long as you make a connection between glucose becoming energy, the mitochondria is involved, that's fine. And the reality is not just glucose, of course, it's glucose and oxygen. And it's not just glucose and oxygen, you also have some water in there. And it's not energy like you think of energy that keeps this place lit. It is not electricity, it is an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphate groups attached. And the energy is actually in the bonds of those 3 phosphates. So they show the molecule here. You'll notice the 3 phosphate groups here, here, and here. Well, it is these bonds. When these bonds are broken, that's what releases the energy. And this first bond that gets broken, the farthest phosphate group gets released. That's where the majority of the energy is stored. So if we release that phosphate group, then we end up with 2 phosphates. So we go from having adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate, ADP. And then we can release that next phosphate, and we end up with adenosine monophosphate, AMP. Well, the reality is, releasing those other phosphates isn't really very advantageous. What we want to do is we want to create the molecule that has the 3 phosphate groups attached to it, because that's where we get the most energy from that farthest phosphate bond over here. Now, backing up just a second. So, here's the thing about glucose, about sugar, and about ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We spend a lot of our time during the day making energy, and of course making proteins. And the energy we make is in the form of adenosine triphosphate. And the organelle that is in the cell that makes the energy is the mitochondria. Now, if you think about the United States and the power plants that we have all over the United States, most of the power plants in the United States are still run on coal. They still burn coal. The burning coal creates heat. The heat spins a turbine. This turbine spins a magnet inside of a copper coil, right? This is releasing electrons. The release of electrons is what we call electricity. They flow through here and give us our lights. You can think of the mitochondria in a very similar way, like a power plant. If you think of it, instead of burning coal, instead of a lump of coal being burnt as fuel, think of a lump of glucose as that fuel. Which means, just like with the power plants, they always have to have enough coal on hand to keep burning, otherwise the fires will go out. And if the fires go out, the electricity stops. And in a cell, if electricity stops, the cell starts to die. So cells always want to make sure they have glucose nearby to burn. So you're going to find it in the cytoplasm. And just like the power plant, you'll notice the power plants are always sitting right next to
Water.
water, or train station, train lines, right? So we can easily transport coal to that area. So when the pile of coal at the power plant starts to get low, they can make a phone call and they say, hey, we need another delivery, before it gets too low. And it's easy to deliver. You just keep it right there. In fact, they'll just even keep barges coming all the time with coal on it. Rail lines coming all the time with coal on it. So that way it just is right there when they need it delivered. That's a lot like how we have glucose in our blood. That's why we have glucose in our blood. Do you ever notice that people can have low glucose as well as high glucose? Right? Which means there must be a reason to keep glucose in our blood. It's so that it can get into the cells that need it when they need it. And of course, if we have excess, we put it in storage cells. But glucose is kind of a big molecule. It doesn't get into a cell very easily. Glucose has to have a delivery guy. Glucose has to have a guy who says, come with me, I know where you need to go, I know the cells that need you, I know where the storage cells are, and I'm the guy with the passcode. I'm the guy who's going to open this door for you. What's the name of this delivery guy? I'm sorry? Insulin. Have you heard of this? You guys know about insulin, right? When do you usually think of insulin? When somebody starts talking about insulin, what's your first thought? Diabetic patients. Because what's a diabetic patient? Diabetic patient, in some cases, is a patient who doesn't have insulin, doesn't have any delivery guys. Well, that creates a big problem, because when those cells have a pile of glucose, and that pile is getting lower and lower and lower, and they call for help, and they say, please deliver us some glucose. We know it's out there somewhere, because it is. It's in the blood. And there's no delivery guys to deliver it. The cells don't get the glucose it needs, which means the cells can't make the energy they need, which takes me back to the low energy state that I talked about before, most powerful concept in medicine, which is why you said these patients are going to be lethargic, or fatigued, or tired, or whatever word they want to use. It all means the same thing. It means they don't have the energy to do something. They don't have the energy because they don't have the glucose coming in. don't have the glucose coming in because they don't have the delivery guys. So what do we give these patients? We give them delivery guys. We give them insulin. Stick some insulin in, and that's all that is, a bunch of delivery guys all coming in at once. Taking the glucose by the hand, saying, I know where you need to go, punching in the code, getting the glucose in, and then off to the liver, be recycled. Liver does a lot. Over 500 different things, does a lot of things. Now, think about this for a minute. If a cell is starting to run out of energy, it's going to make a phone call saying, we need more fuel for our energy production. One of the places that's going to go is to the brain, right? And your brain's going to say, well, I need more fuel, I need more energy, I need more something to get me making my ATP. Your brain's going to interpret this as you're hungry. Right? If you need fuel, you must get fuel inside your body. So you start eating, and eating, and eating, and getting the sugar in. That should be it. That should do the trick. But the cells still aren't getting glucose because they don't have a delivery guy. So it sends a message back to the brain. It says, hey man, seriously, we are running out of fuel. Got to get a delivery here soon. The brain says, we must be low. Grab some more food. Start eating some more. Put all this glucose into the blood, but it's not going where it's needed. It's not going into the cells. That's where it's needed. It needs to get into the cell. Every cell is responsible for making its own energy. So it's got to get the glucose in there. If it can't, the cell is going to die. Lights are going to go out. And then you stick this guy's finger and get a drop of blood. And what do you discern from this drop of blood using a glucometer? The number is going to be high. Oh, he has high blood sugar. Of course he does. Why does he have high blood sugar? Because it's not getting into the cells. And his brain kept saying, we need more fuel. Because we're getting signals from all these cells saying, we don't have any fuel. So the only logical answer is, get more fuel into the body. They got lots of sugar. It's just in the wrong place. It's got to go into the cell. That's where insulin is very important. So we see that in type 1 diabetics. Type 2 diabetics, a little bit different. Type 2 diabetics is more about broken down machinery, overuse of machinery, stripped bolts, things that have gotten used and unused and used so much that they don't function the same. It's not, in that case, it's not necessarily about a shortage of insulin. It's about those doors not opening it up when you punch the code in, for instance. That's a problem. You know, anybody knows that if we went over and took this door off the hinges with a screwdriver, and then later in the afternoon put it back on, and then the next day took it off the hinges and took those screws out, and the next day put it back on, the next day took it off the hinges, next day put it back on, next day took it off the hinges, next day put it back on, next day took it off the hinges, next day put it back on. After a while, what would happen to those screws? What would happen to the material that we're screwing into?
Get worn out.
It's going to get stripped, it's going to get worn out. After a while, that door is going to start to change, right? It's not going to be as square as it was before. It's not going to sit like it did before. It might even fall out when you open it up. It's going to create problems. What could you have done to avoid that? What could you have done to avoid that problem with our door falling off the hinges?
Use it properly. Eat properly.
No, we're talking about the door, not eating.
Used it the way it was intended.
Use it the way it was intended. How about not taking it on and off the hinges all the time? Doesn't that seem like a simple answer? Wouldn't you, in fact, even say to me, what kind of idiot are you? There's no purpose, there's no need to take the door on and off the hinges, but you do it every day. Why would you do that? That's how we feel when we see people who are driving through McDrive-through every day, getting the same kind of, I'm going to use air quotes so I learned how to do this, food as they go through the drive-through. And we tell them, why do you do that every day? And they're smoking packs and packs of cigarettes and drinking and drugs and other things. And we say, why do you do that? And it's frustrating. And you want to grab them and shake them, but the law says you can't. I'm just kidding. It is incredibly frustrating because it's an easy answer. Wouldn't you look at me and say, what are you doing, you moron? There's no reason. You're actually putting more effort into it. Don't touch the door. Leave it. It's fine. You would think I was an idiot. You would think. I didn't say you do think. You would think I was an idiot. I'm not an idiot. I'm not very smart either, but I'm not an idiot. Cyanide. Cyanide actually inhibits cytochrome C oxidase. One of the steps in the electron transport chain, the mitochondria. You stop that step, if you inhibit that step, the cell cannot make energy. And when it can't make energy, then the lights go out. Everything goes dim. Machinery stops working. The cell starts to die. That's not good. And all cells start to die, including the brain cells, which means you can see irreversible cell death in, boy, I don't know, yeah, about 20 minutes. That's a good guess. It's not a guess. It's exactly what you're supposed to know. All right, here she is doing some stuff. I honestly don't know why they have things like that. Okay, you can read through these things. A small scene is recognizable chemical as an element. Elements made of atoms. Please understand the pH scale. Where does stomach acid fall? Any idea?
Slightly acidic.
3? Good, yes. If you'd say 2 to 4, 1 to 3, something like that. It depends on the book you read, but those are all correct answers. 1 to 3, 2 to 4. Depends on the book you read. Where's blood?
7.35.
So a good average would be 7.4. Is about where we want to find blood. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Low energy state is the most powerful concept we find in medicine. That's going to affect every system in the body. The further you can see, a patient is going to get more urinary tract infections. Why? Why would a person who has a low energy state, where their cells have low energy, why would they get more urinary tract infections?
Not moving it as much.
Not
So their bladder would be sitting idle for things to grow.
idle bladder syndrome? Yes. They would be voiding as often, perhaps. Well, that, how about, and not as forcefully. Why would they have more upper respiratory infections?
Probably laying down a lot. Accumulates in your lungs.
Absolutely, yeah. Immune system definitely would be requires energy as well. What if you get something in your lungs that your lungs decide they don't want there? What does your body do?
Cough.
Cough. And how does that occur? That's a lot of muscle contraction, right? If you can't cough out forcefully, doesn't that mean you're going to have more things sticking around your lungs that shouldn't be there? Of course. The cilia that move things out. They're not going to have the same movement. So they're going to have, these patients are going to have more respiratory diseases. Now stop and think about that for just a minute. Because everybody in here is going to have somebody in their family who's a diabetic, or knows someone who's a diabetic. And what is diabetes about? People will say, well, it's about sugar, glucose, insulin, blah, blah, blah. So what about energy? They will tell you, any medical textbook on the planet will tell you that a patient with a diabetes, first three things you see is they pee a lot, they drink a lot, and they eat a lot. Well, yes, yes, and yes. But the reality is the first thing that shows up before anything else is the low energy state. The mom will say, oh yeah, he's been lethargic lately. Or the patient will say, I've been tired a lot lately. That's the first thing that shows up before anything else. All those textbooks, they're all lying to you. Now if you read down through it, it'll tell you somewhere all the other signs, and it'll say, oh, and by the way, they'll be tired, they'll be fatigued, they'll be lethargic, they'll be weak, or whatever they want to call it. It's all the same thing. So diabetes, which is going to affect everybody in here in one way or another, family member, friend, some spouse, something, pet, even, something. And they're going to say, well, it's all about sugar, it's all about energy. Now, if you wanted to, you could memorize all the signs and symptoms that you'd expect to see in a patient with diabetes. But if you understand things like, this patient's going to have more urinary tract infections because they can't void with the same kind of force because of low energy. This just makes sense. That's how I like to learn medicine. When it makes sense. That's what medicine is to me. When all this stuff actually makes sense. I don't have to memorize a whole bunch of signs and symptoms. I already know what they're going to be. I can expect it because I understand how this stuff works. So I'm trying to take you into that world a little bit, to where you get to the point where you understand how it works. If you understand how it works, you don't have to memorize any of this. It just makes sense. You don't have to, if you memorize the problems with a patient who has some sort of trauma to the cranium, some sort of head trauma, and you can think of all the signs and symptoms, or you can think of head trauma equals possibility of cerebral hemorrhage, hematoma. Excuse me. So now it's a game of pressure. Where do we want more pressure? Where do we want less pressure? And then it comes to that question of, well, what position do we want to put the person in? Well, definitely not something that's going to increase the pressure. Definitely not Trendelenburg. Makes sense when it comes to questions like that, right? You can see it. So that's kind of where I want to bring you on some of this. All right, we talked about metabolism. We didn't talk about Juanita. Called to scene of a 17-year-old lady feeling confused. Oh man. Feeling confused sounds like neurons aren't getting the energy they need, which means they're not getting the fuel they need. Just that quick, right? Patient's blood glucose is low. What a surprise. This patient doesn't have a problem with it going to cell. This patient has a problem with the glucose getting into the blood to begin with. Glucophage, metformin, blocks glucose absorption. Do you know one of the side effects of glucophage is anorexia? Not anorexia nervosa, anorexia, decreased appetite. It's actually a good, helpful in a lot of patients who have, let me back up. This is a medication that's used for patients who have type 2 diabetes. And so not only does it work very, very well in getting glucose that's in the blood into the places that needs it, but it also decreases absorption in the stomach, which is going to decrease overall blood glucose. So it's almost a beneficial side effect in patients who have type 2 diabetes, because oftentimes patients with type 2 diabetes are overweight. So it is, in a roundabout way, helpful. Everything you put in your body is going to have a side effect. Don't listen to those commercials. Don't listen to those other people. Don't listen to them. Listen to me. Everything you put in your body has a side effect. First of all, why do we put something in our body? Why do we put water in our body? Why do we put coffee in our body? Why do we put donuts in our body? Thirsty and hungover, and no, I'm just kidding, that's not why I drink coffee. Thirsty, and need to wake up, and of course, hungry and love donuts. That's why we put something in our body, right? With the nutritional value. In the case of food. That's the effect. That's why we do something, for that effect. A side effect is when we get an effect that we didn't necessarily want or didn't necessarily expect. Everything you put in your body has a side effect. A glass of water has a side effect. You have to pee. Don't tell me what to do. Oh, dang it, now I do. Well, if we put that in our body, doesn't it go into our blood? Some of it. And if it goes into our blood, doesn't that increase our blood volume? And if it increases our blood volume, isn't that going to increase blood pressure? Or at least cause mechanisms that are going to change our pressure, maybe vasodilate more? Do something so as to allow for that? Otherwise we'll have higher blood pressure, of course. And we'll see with osmosis, it's going to travel to other places. Now, of course, is that something that's recordable? Oh, no, definitely not. But the point is, it's still there. So anytime you hear this stuff about, they try to sell you something and say no side effects, everything has a side effect. Everything you put in your body has a side effect. So one of the unusual and sort of interesting side effects of metformin or glucophage is that it's somewhat of an anorexic. Also tends to bring down, I think, cholesterol a little bit too. Interesting. Works out well. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Those are all in the book. All right, let's take us to some cells.